In an interesting nuance of the global commercial aviation industry, throughout the latter quarter of the 20th century, a series of European and Asian flag carriers established under their marks wholly owned subsidiaries, which appended the name Asia to their titles. The reason as to the sudden appearance of these sub-brands within the wider firms being due to the significant political fragility of relations between the People's Republic of China and the island nation of Taiwan, resulting in 7 dedicated airlines being created to serve Taiwan without voiding traffic rights into mainland China or vice versa. The political tensions that warranted the creation of these carriers goes back to the end of the Chinese Civil War in December 1949, when forces of the Republic of China, led by General Shanghai Chek, were routed by the armies of the Communist Party of China, led by Chairman Mao Zedong, forcing the armies of the Republic to retreat, along with thousands of refugees, to the island of Taiwan, located 100 miles east of the mainland in the Pacific Ocean, and is now the only surviving remnant of the Republic of China, established in 1911 after the overthrow of the Qing dynasty, the last of the Chinese imperial dynasties, which stretched, through its predecessors, back to around 221 BC. With Chairman Mao having established the People's Republic of China on the mainland, his government proclaimed that, despite the capitalist Republic of China being established in Taiwan, the island was still a territory of the wider People's Republic rather than being its own sovereign state, declaring it to be a rogue territory and thus unrecognized, while the capitalist government in Taiwan refused to acknowledge the takeover of Chairman Mao's communist government in Beijing, a fragile political arrangement that still exists to this day. Come the 1970s, and with the mass expansion of air travel across the globe, national carriers with longer-range airliners such as the Boeing 747 and Douglas DC-10 could provide access to both mainland China and Taiwan, with a majority of the world's governments having recognized the sovereignty of the Republic of China as its own country, and providing direct flights to the nation's capital, Taipei, while the People's Republic of China remained near totally isolated from the Western powers due to the determination of Mao's government to create a communist ideal through events such as the Cultural Revolution of 1966, only starting to open up to the influence of the capitalist West following the creation of diplomatic corridors in the wake of a state visit by US President Richard Nixon in February 1972. With political connections finally being made with Communist China, this was followed by the opening of air corridors by their respective airlines, among the first being Japan Airlines, which signed an agreement with the People's Republic, after 18 months of negotiations, to begin operations between Tokyo, Beijing and Shanghai on April 20, 1974. This agreement also allowing for transit rights via Japan to destinations including Canada, the United States and Latin America, while Japanese travellers would be allowed transit rights via China to the Middle East and Western Europe. This arrangement, however, didn't sit well with the government of the Republic of China, which saw the recognition of the communist regime by the state airline, being an arm of the wider government, as a recognition of the People's Republic by Japan itself, and therefore responded by banning all Japan Airlines operations into Taipei, and halting all flights to Japan by their own carrier, China Airlines, with immediate effect, the vital corridor between Japan and Taiwan being of significant cultural importance to the Japanese government, as from 1895 to 1945, the island nation had been a colony of the Japanese Empire, following the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki at the end of the First Sino-Japanese War, with thousands of the island's residents being either Japanese themselves or of Japanese descent. Eventually, following lengthy negotiations throughout 1974 and into 1975, an accord was reached between the Japanese government and the Republic of China by way of creating a wholly owned subsidiary of Japan Airlines called Japan Asia Airways, which would be allowed to operate to airports in Taiwan from September 15, 1975, provided that it had absolutely no ties to the wider Japanese government, which had recognized the People's Republic, omitting all national symbols and adopting a slightly different livery. Japan Asia Airways commencing work on the route with Boeing 747-200s and Douglas DC-10s, which had the Japan Airlines red crown crane symbol on the tailfin replaced by a red circle with 3 slashes. With services on the primary corridor between Taiwan and Japan now resumed, the matter of state carriers operating into both mainland China and Taipei wouldn't be raised again until 1990, when Qantas, the state airline of Australia, proposed the opening of new routes to the People's Republic, but faced objection from the communist government due to the airline already operating into Taiwan, and therefore, in order to allow the main Qantas airline to provide services to high-demand destinations on the mainland, including Beijing and Shanghai, the company opted to create a wholly owned subsidiary in the same manner as Japan Asia Airways called Australia Asia Airlines. Commencing operations from October 11, 1991, with services running between Sydney and Taipei, 3 aircraft were employed to fly this single route up to twice daily, with 2 of the unusual Boeing 747 SPs and a Boeing 767-300 being introduced, which adopted a modified version of the Qantas livery which didn't display the Australian flag and replaced the kangaroo tailfin logo with an abstract dynamic ribbon. Asia Airlines operating until 1996, when the main Qantas airline was privatised, meaning the carrier was no longer an arm of the state and thus could operate into both Taiwan and mainland China in its own right, the former Asia Airlines units being returned to the regular Qantas fleet. This isn't to say that the demands of operating dedicated subsidiary airlines into Taiwan was solely the burden of foreign carriers, as in 1991, China Airlines, as the national carrier of the Republic of China, faced its own dilemma as, with the opening of political connections between Communist China and the nations of Canada and Australia, these 2 countries placed a significant amount of reliance on trade and financial support from the People's Republic, the government in Beijing being able to sway its substantial influence by ensuring that China Airlines was not allowed to operate directly to destinations in either Canada or Australia, barring them from 2 major markets in the global aviation scene. In response, China Airlines, in association with the Cruise Group, created their own subsidiary carrier known as Mandarin Airlines, which was established on June 1, 1991 and commenced operations from October 16th. The airline, which flew without the flag of the Republic of China painted on the fuselage of its fleet, operating 4 ex-China Airlines Boeing 747 SPs on the primary Taipei to Sydney and Vancouver run, making it Taiwan's first airline to run direct flights to Canada and Australia. Expanding across Eastern Asia, Mandarin Airlines became a near wholly owned subsidiary of China Airlines from October 1992, with the national carrier owning a 90% share in the company, while also introducing more advanced McDonnell Douglas MD-11s from 1993 and Boeing 747-400s from 1995. Although the airline's existence as a major international carrier was very short-lived, due to China Airlines, wishing to avoid the logistical complications of being banned by the People's Republic of China on vital routes to various international destinations, completely refreshing their image by way of a new livery that replaced the colours of the Republic of China flag with a more universal white with lilac and dark blue fuselage and a plum blossom on the tail fin, while also not displaying the nation's flag anywhere on the airframe. With this revised livery satisfying the government of the People's Republic, China Airlines was now able to fly to a wider variety of destinations in its own right, without being the face of a country which the communist regime deemed a rogue territory, and thus Mandarin Airlines' international operations were considered surplus to requirement, and the carrier was fully merged into China Airlines from August 8, 1999, the former international fleet being either sold off or merged into the ranks of its parent company, although Mandarin Airlines continues to operate today as a short to medium range carrier working across Eastern Asia, flying to mainland China, Japan, the Philippines and Vietnam. The next foreign subsidiary to appear was British Asia Airways, which was established on January 20, 1993, in order to operate routes British Airways had inherited from recently absorbed private carrier British Caledonian, whose extensive network across the Far East served many destinations British Airways chose not to invest in. British Asia Airways, introducing a revised variant of the stylish Landor livery, which replaced the Union flag tailfin with the Chinese character Ying Ya, or British Asia, operating a fleet of 5 Boeing 747-400s upon the start of services from March 29th, services to Taipei being routed via Hong Kong's Kai Tak Airport. This was followed the same year by Air France, which initially began operations to Taiwan through partially owned French charter airline Air Charter, using Boeing 747-200s leased from the main Air France company, this arrangement being merely a stopgap until a brand new wholly owned subsidiary was formed from 1994, dubbed Air France Asie, which introduced both freight and passenger services between Paris, Taipei and Osaka via Hong Kong, using 2 of the smallest variants of the Airbus A340, the A340-200, to fly the lower demand passenger operations, while 4 Boeing 747-200s were employed on cargo services, the airline adopting a slightly revised variant of the Air France livery, omitting the colour red from the tail fin representation of the French tricolour, leaving it entirely blue. Next to be formed was Swissair Asia, established in 1995 by the Swiss national carrier, this service utilising a pair of McDonnell Douglas MD-11 trijets, which operated to Taiwan via Bangkok in Thailand, replacing the Federal Cross of Switzerland on the tail fin with the Chinese character Ruxi, a translation of the word Swiss, while during that same year, KLM, The Dutch national carrier presented KLM Asia, which, like Swissair Asia, operated to Taipei via Bangkok using Boeing 747-400s. The revised livery for this subsidiary firm, replacing the stylized Dutch Royal Crown with simply the word Asia. While the operation of Asian subsidiaries for the Taiwan route lasted throughout the 90s, by the turn of the new millennium, the justification for operating an airline within an airline was beginning to fade, especially as the Taipei route for many of these carriers had not the passenger numbers to substantiate the operation of a separate firm with its own dedicated fleet of aircraft and service patterns. In the wake of the post-9/11 aviation market crash, which saw airline shares collapse as fewer passengers travelled and operational costs spiked, Swissair attempted to offload Swissair Asia in order to help stave off its impending bankruptcy in October 2001, but due to the already fragile situation the company was in financially, following its aggressive overexpansion throughout the 1990s, Swissair was grounded during the same month, and the company liquidated from March 2002, while British Airways, seeing the downturn as a perfect opportunity to sever loss-making routes, axed the British Asia Airways firm in December 2001, and former Boeing 747-400s from the fleet were returned to wider British Airways operations. Air France-Asie maintained its own passenger operations to Taiwan until 2004, whereupon the small-sized Airbus A340-200s were withdrawn from Air France service and sold on to private customers, although Air France-Asie would continue to exist with its cargo arm, using aged 747-200s until 2007, not returning to the Republic of China until April 2018, when the carrier introduced a direct Paris to Taipei service operated by Boeing 777-300ERs. For Japan Asia Airways, amid a loosening of the restrictions implemented by the Taiwanese government during the mid-1970s, in 2002, China Airlines and Taipei-based carrier EVA Air were allowed landing rights at Tokyo's Narita Airport, followed from 2006 by the resumption of services to Osaka for the first time in 32 years. And with the continued expansion of services from the Republic of China, Japan Asia Airways saw its role diminish rapidly, and in April 2008, it was absorbed into Japan Airlines when the carrier resumed flights to Taiwan. Today, the only remainder of this Asian subsidiary requirement for operating to Taiwan is KLM Asia, this shadow firm utilizing a fleet of 7 Boeing 777s to work flights from Amsterdam to Taipei with an onward leg to Manila in the Philippines, although KLM Asia's fleet of dedicated aircraft can be interchanged with the wider KLM roster and have been known to work to other destinations across the globe. Overall, the need for Asian subsidiaries throughout the 1970s, 80s and 90s was centrally based around the need to satisfy the still delicate political relationship between the two nations that proclaim themselves to be the true China. Although with the privatization of several flag carriers and a general easing of the stringent demands of both the communist and capitalist governments, the requirement for these subsidiaries has been rendered largely obsolete, and Taiwan has now been able to open itself up to the wider global aviation market.